In 1954, Alfred Hitchcock's suspense thriller Rear Window was released, narrating a wife murder case from the perspective of an observer across the courtyard. In 1988, the Oscar-winning film Rain Man premiered, showcasing the story of a man with exceptional memory and his brother. Now, imagine a suspense novel where the protagonist possesses the abilities of the character from Rain Man and, coincidentally, witnesses a bizarre murder from his window, much like in Rear Window. Tonight's Shadowy Stories brings you a suspenseful tale adapted from Raymond Chandler's masterpiece, The Witness for the Prosecution, a work deeply appreciated by Stephen King. Let's see what kind of intriguing and shocking case this work presents to us. August 29th, 5:30 p.m. Chicago. After leaving my father's funeral, my mood became even more depressed. It wasn't because of his accidental death while weeding, but because it meant I had to shoulder his responsibilities and take care of my younger brother, Thomas, with whom he had been living. My name is Ray Gilblade, 38 years old, an illustrator working in downtown Chicago. I rarely return to the mountain village cabin where my father and brother Thomas lived, because Thomas is a madman. Perhaps my language is a bit harsh, but he does have severe mental health issues. Since adolescence, he's only locked himself indoors, studying maps day and night. After the internet became widespread, he switched to staring at electronic maps on his computer nonstop. He says he's touring the globe, and that he's doing this for his ultimate dream. I'm sure you, hearing this, think the same as I do. Thomas is a complete lunatic incapable of self-care. To take care of him, my father sold our house in the city after our mother passed away, saying he wanted to save a large sum of money to get Thomas complete treatment from a psychiatrist. So many years have passed, and it seems that besides getting older and his beard growing longer, in my opinion, Thomas's condition hasn't improved at all. But no matter how much I dislike it, he is still my brother. Thinking this, I opened the door to the wooden cabin where Thomas lived. The first floor was unusually tidy, but once I went upstairs to Thomas's room, I instantly saw his extremely messy bedroom and hallway. You didn't even want to attend Father's funeral, did you? He emerged from a pile of printed maps, immediately jumping to his computer desk. I have a more important task than Father's death. Oh yeah, I was furious, immediately walking behind him. Damn it. This room stinks terribly. How can he stand it? He remained at the computer, continuing to play with the Earth model on his screen. Dad is gone. That's in the past. Right, you need to look forward. You need to learn to accept new things. And what I'm controlling now is the client of a panoramic world. It can take me to every corner of the world. I'm going to remember every street in every corner. Do you know how many places in the world are called Dublin? Stop. 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 I immediately interrupted him because he was having another episode, becoming immersed in his own world again. I know your so-called panoramic world software. It's nothing but a global map 3D panoramic app developed by some New Yorker. I'm not a caveman. Don't show off to me, I muttered, starting to tidy up his dirty clothes and socks. He, however, couldn't stop introducing to me how many streets in Rome he had memorized through this online map, and how he had memorized the location of every store in Manhattan. Finally, I couldn't stand it anymore and raised my voice, saying, "If you say another word, I'll throw the dinner I bought you downstairs." At this moment, Thomas looked like a timid 10-year-old child, quietly lowering his head and turning around without saying a word, continuing to operate his computer. Immediately afterward, I felt a pang of guilt, because before me was my younger brother, who has a long-term mental illness. I probably shouldn't have acted like that, but I didn't intend to apologize. I simply walked out of his room. My father left many things regarding Thomas, such as the appointment with Drive, Julie this week that hasn't been arranged yet, and Drive, Julie might not even know about my father's death. I decided to go to her clinic before dinner. Firstly, to inform her that I would be taking over Thomas's appointments from now on, and secondly, perhaps to rekindle my relationship with her. While driving to the city, my mind kept flashing back to what had happened between Julie and me. During the 6 or 7 years of taking Thomas for appointments, I had driven my brother there a few times, and back and forth, Julie and I hit it off. However, our relationship was only physical during a few dates, and after that, I went to work in New York and hadn't contacted her for a long time. Perhaps it was a regret. I guess Julie thought so too. As soon as I knocked on her door, she asked, "Greg, I can't believe it's you. Back from New York?" "Yeah, I've been back for a month or two." I scratched my head, not telling her that I had actually been living back in Chicago for over 2 years. "How's the work over there? Working as a contractor for Panoramic World. Is the pressure high?" "It's okay. The project is finished, and I'll be back soon." She started pouring me water. "I thought you'd completely forgotten about me. Where did you live in New York?" I almost completely followed her questions. She always did this, except when she was doing therapy, until I remembered the purpose of my visit, and explained my intention. By the time I had finished, it was already past 7 p.m., and I remembered my brother starving in that wooden cabin. I rushed back. I figured Thomas had never eaten dinner this late. By the time I warmed up the pie, it was already 9:40 p.m. He shambled to the dining table, throwing his iPad aside as if he were exhausted. Judging by his expression, he was probably starving. However, he just picked up the honey bottle, thought for a moment, and put it down again, muttering, "It shouldn't be." What shouldn't be? At first, I was a little impatient with his attitude, but remembering my harsh reprimand this afternoon, I asked softly, "Is it because my cooking is not good enough?" He looked into my eyes and said, 677 Garden Street, New York. It's not a clothing store. His second floor west-facing window. Why is there a mannequin? I rolled my eyes. I knew I shouldn't have asked. His listless expression wasn't caused by hunger. He was still immersed in his maps, wishing I would call him for dinner later. "Thomas, you can think whatever you want after dinner, but don't interrupt me while I'm washing the dishes." "Okay." I once again reverted to being impatient and told him. But it shouldn't be. His obsession came back again, and he even handed me his unturned-off iPad. "Look, before the last map update, the first floor was a coffee shop. Why would they put a fashion mannequin there?" I knew I shouldn't pay attention to the nonsense of this madman, but after glancing at it unintentionally, I realized that what he said wasn't entirely unreasonable. He remembered the appearance of every shop and resident on every street he had seen, and indeed, in the street view of Panoramic World, there was a very abrupt white fashion mannequin sticking out of the window, almost about to fall onto the road. But soon, hunger overwhelmed my curiosity. I pushed away the iPad and perfunctorily replied, "Maybe the dessert shop owner has a peculiar dressing habit. You know, it's called freedom." I buried myself in my dinner again, but the guy in front of me didn't say a word for a while until he suddenly shouted, "You're right, Greg." I was startled, and found that he had zoomed in on the street view image on the tablet and excitedly raised it in front of me. "You're right, it's a person. It's not a mannequin." "Thank you." This statement immediately captured my attention. I narrowed my eyes and looked at the enlarged photo again, but in the next second, I gasped. Although the enlarged photo was blurry, it could be seen that it wasn't a fashion mannequin in the window, but a woman's face covered with a white cloth, her body still convulsing and struggling due to suffocation. This wasn't some weird dressing habit. There must be a guy holding the end of the white cloth behind this person. This was a blatant murder. Oh my God. Thomas. I was so scared that I dropped my fork. When was this photo updated? He didn't understand what I meant. So he swiped down the screen to check the watermark. The Street View car should be. It passed by at 3:57 p.m. on August 20, 2014. That is, more than a week ago. More than a week ago. Garden Street, New York. There was a murder in broad daylight. And at that time, a panoramic World Street View car happened to pass by and captured the scene. In an instant, many thoughts flashed through my mind. But in the end, only one decision was made: to call the police. Oh man, my hands are shaking terribly. After all, I had never encountered any murder cases, and I nervously dialed the phone. The operator was obviously a local police officer. Hello, officer. I have to report a crime. Someone is dead. A female police officer's voice asked me to calm down. I'm saying, my brother found out that someone might have died in New York a week ago. Wait. The other side seemed even more confused. Are you in Chicago? Where did your brother find this? I swallowed another mouthful of saliva. You may not believe it. He has a mental illness. So he's been online. He found it online. The other side hung up the phone. I realized that Thomas was staring at me blankly. I actually thought it was a person too. But why didn't you check the newspaper first? He was right. My God, I actually didn't. My mentally unstable brother is shocking. I had completely lost interest in my dinner, perhaps because of witnessing my father's burial. I couldn't bear to watch a life die before my eyes without reason. I pulled out my laptop, closed the drawing software that had been running, and started searching for August 20th, 677 Garden Street. Murder. Immediately, nothing I wanted to see appeared, which left me unsure whether I was more disappointed or relieved. Thomas suddenly poked his head out from behind the sofa. Try removing the word murder, he said. I listened and did as he said. This time, the first result was a missing person report. I read the title aloud in a low voice. 677 Garden Street. Resident Allison Scully. 203, missing. Last sighting at the Garden Street construction site. Thomas started thinking again. Try searching for both 203 and 204, both of which have a window facing south, which is the side seen in the street view. Sometimes you have to admire him. He really remembers the layout of every street he's seen. I unconsciously turned to Thomas. Do you think it's possible that this Allison is the person who was murdered? The murderer hid the body afterward. So there was this report. He sent the enlarged street view image to my computer, printed out and drive to New York to ask around. What you know then, August 31st, 3:57 p.m. New York. A blonde woman walked to the corner. Even though her pace wasn't hurried, her expression showed that she was pretending to be calm. She made a phone call, and the man on the other end asked first, "Did you take care of it?" The woman took off her gloves and replied, "I have some news you might not like to hear. He got away, and I think I killed the wrong person." August 31st, 9:41 a.m. New York. For the past 2 days, I've been asking myself why I actually listened to my crazy brother and came here. I had official business. I had to come to a New York gallery to buy some artwork, but I couldn't resist the urge, so I went to the street where the Street View car took the picture. Now I'm across from 677 Garden Street. I got out of the car, still holding the printed, slightly creepy photo of the murder scene. All right, life is precious, I muttered to myself. This is also the reason I told myself to come here. It was not until I almost crossed Garden Street that I realized the scene in front of me was exactly the same as the photo in my hand. The quiet coffee shop on the street, the open windows on the second and third floors, the greenery on the windowsills. except for the head covered with a white cloth, suffocated to death. I adjusted my breathing and thought about several questions and tones to ask. Knocked on the door of number 677. And then I heard slow footsteps from behind the door. I stood straighter, my heart almost leaping into my throat. But when the door opened, what greeted me was a stern-looking old woman. "What do you want?" I was speechless. All the sentences I had thought of were completely forgotten. I only stuttered, "Hello. This is... how? Does Allison Scully live in 203? She looked me up and down. "So what? What do you want to ask?" "That girl didn't pay her rent and ran away. Disappeared without a trace." "Yeah?" I immediately asked. "She always does this. She's the one in the whole building who's the least consistent with rent payments." I asked her again, "Are you sure she's not in any danger? Have you checked her room?" She looked me up and down with sharp eyes again. "Kid, if you're new to New York, you should learn to read the local news more often. Her room has been sealed off after that suicide case." "Okay, what's going on?" I thought I would hear some ordinary truth, knowing it was a misunderstanding. But it seems far from simple. I hastily said goodbye to the landlady, ordered a long black at a coffee shop downstairs, opened my computer, and started searching for what happened here more than a week ago. There were too many news reports from New York. Dramas were unfolding here all the time. The old police chief marrying a new wife, a deadly chain collision, the Beckley Bakery opening another chain store. All sorts of big and small events were reported. I kept scrolling and paging until I saw this. 200 to resident Candace of 676 Garden Street committed suicide at a neighbor's house. I read on, and that's right. This Candace was the victim in the photo. For some reason, she suffocated to death by the window of Allison's rental apartment, leaving a note with a short suicide note. It was considered suicide. No traces of murder were found at the scene. It seems that the perpetrator was an extremely cunning and professional killer, but he was inadvertently caught on camera by Thomas. What a coincidence. Let's stop here, I told myself, left the coffee shop, and prepared to drive back to Chicago. August 31st, 10:08 a.m., New York. In the office of Panoramic World, Lewis sat in his office, pondering over the man holding the printed photo in the Garden Street surveillance footage. These days, he has been repeatedly observing everything under this camera. After all, as the current person in charge, the task assigned to him and Nicole not only failed but also killed the wrong person, which is a huge loophole. He just couldn't figure out what kind of relationship this man had with Allison because he felt that this face was a little familiar. No. It's because he's related to Allison. Lewis suddenly opened the archive of the website design outsourcing project more than 2 years ago and was surprised to find a man exactly the same as the one in the surveillance footage, Ragil Blade. He smiled triumphantly. I'm very satisfied with my memory. Then, he took out his cell phone hidden in his jacket and called Nicole. The other side seemed to be driving. Lewis, I'm pretending to be at work again. He sneered. You know, I have to have a public job identity to do this kind of thing with you. To get to the point, I have a new task for you. September 1st, 6:20 p.m., Chicago. The weather delayed my journey, and I didn't get back to Thomas's house until this time. Fortunately, before I left, I asked Julie to come to the house to temporarily look after Thomas for a few days. This wasn't her job, but for my sake, she said she was willing to do it. As soon as I opened the door, I found that the first floor was also in a mess. Thomas's matte printouts were scattered all over the floor, and the two of them were sitting on the floor looking at the computer. This was different from what I had imagined. Julie greeted me first, stood up to greet me. Thomas still didn't turn his head, only saying, Greg, I told Julie about New York, but we've already reached Java Island. I ignored Thomas and turned to Julie. What's going on? All these printouts. Reg, he told me that sometimes letting him be in his comfortable environment allows him to see his truest state of mind. It's not dinner time yet. Should we relax a bit first? My face immediately turned red. I quickly said, Julie, my computer bag and artwork haven't been put away yet. Seeing me turn away, she seemed even more excited. Threw all my things onto the sofa and dragged me into the study. Don't blame your brother. She closed the door and pressed me onto the chaise lounge in the study. It seems that he has completely figured out the layout of my house in these few days. In that case, I don't need to rush to discuss what I saw and heard with them. As for the woman in front of me, I'd rather obey than resist. Just as she took off her coat and lay on my chest, Thomas suddenly shouted outside the door, Reg, something's wrong. We'll talk later, I answered him, but then I heard his footsteps running towards the study. Because of his shout, Reg, something's wrong. Julie and I were very flustered, putting on our clothes and getting up from the chaise lounge. Thomas suddenly burst open the door, but seeing us both undressed, he didn't care, only raising his iPad again. The head is gone, while putting on my shirt. I walked closer and found that the street view photo in his hand was indeed the window of 677 Garden Street, and the watermark was still 3:57 p.m. on August 20, 2014. But he was right. The head covered with the white cloth and the person behind it were gone, replaced by a blurry black mass. After getting dressed, the three of us sat in a circle on the sofa with the computer and tablet. Okay, let's review this again, said Julie, whose flushed face hadn't faded yet. The crime scene photo is like a ghost. Suddenly disappeared, and only the victim's part disappeared. I couldn't understand, and gave my opinion. But there was a murder that day. The suicide case I just told you about. The time, place, and manner of death completely matched. Since it's already been ruled a suicide, the killer doesn't need to erase this evidence. And how could the killer erase it? Julie suddenly asked Thomas. Is it possible that this is a new photo? Replaced. The timestamp just hasn't been changed yet. However, when we compared the printout with the new photo, except for the black shadow, we didn't find any difference. Even the people on the street, the coffee on the table in the coffee shop were exactly the same. There are only two possibilities for this. Thomas finally spoke. Either he's a hacker, or he's an employee of Panoramic World. Thomas's words instantly enlightened me. Although the outsourcing project had ended a long time ago, I was still in contact with some of the former colleagues. I first thought of Antonio, who had been working as a technical consultant for street view photography at Panoramic World, although it was impolite to call him at this hour, considering his authority at Panoramic World. I thought it was necessary to ask. The result was that I called 3 times without an answer, and Julie even began to suspect that he had been dismissed. He began to search for information about the current street view photography technical consultant, but he seemed to freeze suddenly, staring blankly at the screen. What's wrong? Julie leaned over to ask. He said Antonio is the current consultant. He died last night. Dead? Thomas jumped up, almost knocking my computer to the ground. Julie gasped, saying in a trembling voice, found dead in the company's fire escape. Suffocated. September 1st, 7:06 p.m. Evanston, on a suburban highway at night. The car was speeding towards Chicago. The blonde woman in the driver's seat answered the phone, and the man's voice came from the car speakers. You did a clean job this time. Don't mention it, she replied sarcastically. It's thanks to Mr. Lewis helping me get old Antonio to the stairs. You've done a great job. I know you're tired and resentful these days, but for solving Gil Blade's problem, Howard will definitely pay us a large sum in advance as an interim settlement. Nick didn't say anything more, just said, got it, and hung up the phone. The road sign to Chicago had already passed the car, according to the employee file of Ray Gilblade given to her by Lewis. She dialed his home phone number. September 1st, 7:12 p.m. Chicago. The three of us were still shocked by the fact that Antonio was murdered in the same way. And the next second, we were startled by the sudden ringing of my phone. I quickly answered the phone and asked, "Hello? This is Reg. What's up?" There was no sound on the other side, only a crackling sound, and then it hung up. "Who called?" Julie asked, and I was also puzzled, guessing it was a wrong number or a harassing call. However, Thomas started pacing back and forth. "Reg, I guess you're in trouble." No, we're all in trouble. A storm is coming." "Storm?" I was angry at his mysterious look, but Julie still maintained her professionalism, asked me to be quiet, then went up to comfort Thomas, trying to figure out what he meant. Thomas handed the printed photo to us again, showing an unprecedented serious expression. "You need to understand now that we have a photo that might be unique in Chicago. No, in the whole of the United States. Oh, maybe the whole world. A piece of evidence from a murder scene." I interrupted him. "Thomas, get to the point." "My point is, something must have happened yesterday that made the killer or the planner aware of the existence of this evidence. So he used Antonio to destroy the evidence online and silenced him." Julie gasped. "It's inferred that this person or group is organized and planned, and their actions are so quick," Thomas said. "Indeed, but that's not the point. The point is what happened yesterday that let them know their murder was exposed." He pointed at my chest, and at that moment, I felt like I was struck by lightning. I didn't know what kind of big event we ordinary people had encountered, but I suddenly understood what my brother meant. I was holding the photo and appeared openly on Garden Street, which made the organization aware of the secret leak. If I were them, I would need to eliminate not only Antonio but also Gilblade, who still had the photo. "I think we need to call the police." I realized the seriousness of the situation and started to dial the local police station. "Julie, you need to leave our house immediately. Especially the farther away the better. That call just now was definitely not a wrong number." Julie nodded quickly and started packing her bags. Considering the last incident, I called my father's old friend, Officer Duckworth, or rather, retired officer, because I believed that only he would believe what his old friend's child said. Although he told me that he had instructed several officers to keep a close watch on my house tonight, I still couldn't sleep all night, tossing and turning. Finally, looking at the clock approaching 3:15 a.m., I thought I might as well take Thomas to a motel for a few days and hide as long as possible. That settled, I told Officer Duckworth about my plan and was about to go upstairs to call Thomas, but I was surprised to find that the door to our basement was already open. I wanted to turn on the hallway lights and the stair lights, but I found that the circuit breaker seemed to be turned off, so I had to walk quietly into the basement in the dark. I didn't dare to call my brother's name. I was afraid that this shout would bring out someone hiding in the dark to attack me. In the messy basement, I bumped into things more than once, and finally, after my eyes adapted to the darkness, I saw Thomas lying beside the circuit breaker. "What a good brother." A female voice suddenly came from behind me. I turned my head around, and a gun was pointed at my head. A blonde, black-clad woman walked out calmly, looked down at a certain photo, and said to herself, "I have to take a closer look at the photo this time to avoid catching the wrong person again." Heaven knows how she could see the photo clearly in such a dark basement, but from her words, I could deduce that she was the killer who had killed Candice by mistake, hunted Allison, and murdered old Antonio. She said again, "Carry your brother and go with me. Quickly." My goodness, she didn't even give me a break, and I didn't dare to disobey. so I had to carry the unconscious Thomas, pointed at by a gun, and walked out of the house, just as I was wondering why Duckworth had said that he had arranged patrols near my house, but still let this woman get away. A man suddenly got out of the police car parked in front of my house, and he greeted us triumphantly. I knew waiting for half an hour wasn't in vain. Something bad happened. I didn't understand what this well-dressed man could do, but I knew that they were definitely not ordinary people, and their methods were extremely vicious. After stuffing them both into their car trunk, the man in a suit said, "Howard wants to ask that woman named Nicole personally." Without saying a word, he tied us both together and stuffed us into the back of my car, leaving the police car still parked at the door, and drove away in my SUV. During this bumpy ride, I couldn't move. My waist and back ached, and I had difficulty breathing, but I silently counted how many intersections we had passed, how many gas stations we had been to, until our car stopped. The trunk was creaked open. It was still night outside. It seems that the people in the car had driven for a whole day. Nick dragged me, with a dry throat, and Thomas, who had woken up but still remained silent, directly into an antique shop. I have to say that this female killer's strength was real. When we were thrown into a corner of the shop, the man in a suit started to turn on the lights inside, and I finally could see another man in his 50s sitting in a chair. "Are you from the state prosecutor's office?" I knew his voice was low, and I didn't understand what he was saying. "Sir, you've misunderstood," I said, my throat hurting. "I'm just a white-collar worker in Chicago." "My brother, he's even a madman. Doesn't even have a job." Thomas glared at me. Then the middle-aged man turned to him and asked, "Then how did you get this evidence? Where is that photo now?" Thomas sneered disapprovingly. "I saw it by chance while pursuing my dream. I guess my brother probably thought he was in an action movie. I couldn't stand his behavior." The man was very puzzled and asked him what his dream was. Thomas straightened his chest even more and said, "His dream is to memorize all the maps in the world, so that when electronic maps become popular and paper maps disappear, if the internet is destroyed by war one day, he will be the only living map in the world. Yes, everyone. That's my brother's ultimate dream." Obviously, the man was completely dumbfounded. He looked at Thomas with the eyes of an idiot. "You mean you browse various street views every day, so you happen to see it?" Thomas's eyes suddenly lit up, as if he had completely forgotten that he was still being held hostage. "You don't believe me? I guess we're at the Burr Antique Shop in New York now, because only this antique shop in New York has such a large piece of broken glass on its side door. The 4 houses to the east are all residential, and the 5th one has a storefront, which is a bicycle shop." "My goodness." The man's loud exclamation obviously confirmed Thomas's guess. Then, the side door with safety hazards was pushed open, and another tall man walked in. "So many distinguished guests tonight," I muttered to myself. The person ignored Nick and the man in a suit and went directly to the man interrogating us. "Howard, are these two helping the prosecutor hide your mistress?" Howard hesitated. "I'm a little uncertain now." The upright man glanced at us. "You'd better ask clearly. Otherwise, if the evidence escapes, it will be extremely detrimental to your election. You know," I started to sort out the information in front of me, but one question kept lingering in my mind. Why was this man so familiar in the end? Had I met him before, or in a report? I know. The person in front of me was Maurice Sonic, the old police chief of New York I saw in the news reports that day. His wife, Cindy Candace, who was much younger than him, was the woman found dead in Garden Street, to be precise. The woman killed by mistake by the killer named Nick. I seemed to have caught a lifeline. I didn't know what kind of vested interests the people in front of me had, but I was sure that the only hope was to create an internal conflict. "Officer Morris," I shouted his name loudly, and he instinctively looked at me. I was right. Do you know that your wife, Candace, committed suicide? He and Howard both looked puzzled, but I clearly saw that Nick and the man in a suit, who were on standby behind them, were panicked. Morris crouched down. I know what you want to say. It was Allison who killed him, then escaped and disappeared, isn't it? I also imitated Thomas's and said, the real killer is standing behind you. Morris was surprised and stood up, turning to look at the two people. I have something to add. You can check their contact records, or I have a more direct photo as evidence. Before I could ask Thomas where he hid the photo, Nick had already taken the lead, raising his gun and pointing it at me. Morris was, after all, an experienced chief, and he quickly drew his gun, shooting Nick before she could shoot. But the bullet deflected, and he was also shot. But he showed no sign of falling. The fallen Nick, gritting her teeth in pain, shouted to the man in a suit, "Lewis, there's a bulletproof vest." He instantly understood Nick's meaning, lowered his body to dodge Morris's bullet, and was about to pick up the gun to aim at Morris's lower body. The scene had become a complete mess. The unarmed Howard also shrank back. I took the opportunity to kick Thomas. He stumbled and broke the glass of the side door and ran out. Go for help. Living map. This was my last shout, and he immediately understood my meaning and rushed into the night. Several people were still fighting. The antiques in the antique shop were shattered by gunfire. But at one moment, all the fighting stopped. Morris, who was still standing, pointed his gun at Howard. My biggest regret is that I joined the wrong side. I believe you can become that mayor. The next second, a gunshot interrupted his anger, and Nick, who was behind the counter, slowly crawled out and shot the winner of this firefight with her other gun. Howard straightened up again. He knew that Morris had come alone, hidden in identity. There were no troops outside the antique shop. The winner of this night's farce was still him. He glanced at the lifeless Lewis and Morris, then looked at me and said, "Sending a lunatic to call for help. That's a clever idea. No matter what kind of living map he is, without a phone in hand, he'll have to run 2 miles to find the police station." But soon, a huge buzzing sound outside caught the attention of the remaining 3 of us, and then a group of firefighters rushed in. They were first confused, then gradually went forward to subdue Howard and the armed Nick. Crowds of people poured in. Finally, Thomas ran to me again. He panted and said, "Go north for 2 intersections, then east. You'll find them. Dad always told me that when something happens, saying there's a fire will always work." Looking at my brother whose hands were still tied, I couldn't help but laugh. In my 38 years of life, I never thought I would be involved in such a fight, and never thought that my family and I would come back from the brink of death, even helping to solve such a political dispute. Perhaps for Thomas, I really have to look at him differently. This is the end of the story adapted from Raymond Chandler's masterpiece, The Witness for the Prosecution. The original work was not only named Book of the Year by Library Journal, but also the Crime Novel of the Year by the Boston Globe. After all, who would have thought that a casual glance at a Street View map would lead to such an intricate murder case, even a political incident? The clever combination of suspense, crime, politics, and genius rescue has destined this book to be adapted into a blockbuster movie. It is predicted that the film adaptation will be directed by Todd Phillips, the director of Joker, and released in 2025. This adapted version of Shadowy Stories is only one of the stories in The Witness for the Prosecution. There are many more cases within the multi-narrative story that we haven't shared with you. Was my father's death really just an accident? What shocking secrets are hidden in Thomas's childhood? What actions led to the FBI's involvement? After reading the original novel, you will find that this episode is only one link in the chain. So this is all for our detective series this time. Thank you for watching and listening. See you in our next Shadowy Stories.